the Tortilla Flats Mural Project Oral Histories. And this would be Jimmy Capito, 1994. The interviewer was Moses Mora, and MB Hanrahan was videotaping. The transcriber, Suzanne Lawrence, who took the interview and condensed it into what we call a rendering. So it's a little bit more of a narration, and that's what you'll be listening to. So the voice is of Jimmy Capito. I spent all my teenage years on Junipero Street. My mother and I lived there at 34 Junipero. I was born in 1935 at 179 South Palm Street, next to the El Patio Hotel. There was a small little alley in the El Patio Hotel, which is still there, and then next to that was the kindergarten on the Palm Street side, where the Greyhound bus depot parking lot is now. I know the very spot. I could walk within 3 feet of it. I was taught to speak Spanish by a number of people. When I would visit Mr. and Mrs. Flores, Mary and Champ, they would begin speaking in Spanish, Jaime or Jimmy, and then they'd tell me something to do, to teach me, and I would be very proud when I knew. Later on, my partners began to teach me. Vincent Diaz and I worked together on a surveying crew for over a year, and he would teach me a new word every day. Sometimes, for the hell of it, we'd get some beers and go over to Moore Park for a Spanish movie. Culturally, I was adopted into the language. I have an old Brewster photo of my grandmother and my grandfather on my father's side. They were married here in Ventura. She grew up in Piru, and her maiden name was Meador. The oldest marked grave in the Piru cemetery is Wilson Meador, her father, and it's dated 1879, the year they married. They lived in a house on Chestnut Street facing the park until they moved to Los Angeles. He went into the carriage and automobile business. A lot of makes came out in that time, and his choice was the Aero car, which went belly up. Once, in 1905, he bought one of those 24 horsepower cars up to Ventura. The Star told how a huge throng of people watched my grandfather and one of his partners go up and down Palm Street demonstrating his car. He played for the first ball team in Ventura. There's a photograph of him in the museum. Carmelita Flores and Herlinda Carne and I served the city of San Buenaventura in 1973 on the very first Historical Preservation Committee. I learned a whole lot listening to their stories. In 1851, when the United States took over California, they set out a Coast Guard ship with a survey crew on it, and they took a detailed survey. Little black marks show adobe buildings, and San Miguel Chapel is still stubbed out. The thing was just ruins. The abutment was there until 1851, though. Enough there, so they showed it. The furthest thing westerly was the Rivas Adobe on the other side of the river. To this day, they have not gone out and located it, but they could probably find the remains of this old adobe. They were known as very hospitable people, and when the river was too big to cross, travelers would stay there. Before May Henning School, in the 1870s, the site was the first courthouse. There was a jail behind it, and a lot of old tales about people being hung in an old tree. In the old Mission Gardens, there were 3 huge palm trees. Ventura was known as a mission town, but the sailors knew it for those palms. About 1880, one got old and broke, so the native daughters built a little stone wall, a little protective area. The whale bones on the little building were first at Angel Escondon's saloon. He was a real citizen, married to one of the Manchaca girls, prettiest girls in California, according to earliest reports. These big whale bones eventually made their way down to that little building, with original mission tile on the roof. With redevelopment, they made some of the grossest mistakes when they tore that place down. I helped do some research on the background of this little building, but it was demolished without any sensitivity or realization that it was a significant little spot. The destruction of the old Pharaoh mansion, too, was a mistake. That place was a home and a half, but it went down. Probably the most distinctive Victorian town in the city at the time, huge, with a mural by a very famous Italian artist. No fanfare or anything. The whole place was leveled for a parking lot for the thrift stores. It was right next to the restaurant on the corner of Figueroa and Santa Clara. That's about when we lost Colombo Street, too. Captain Elwell was a retired seaman in Ventura. I think he married one of the Sanchez daughters. He decided to make Ventura his final home, and he bought these 2 trees and from the Norfolk Islands in the South Pacific as little seedlings, and he planted them beside the mission. In 1975, they were 105 feet and almost 100 years old. I know because the city engineers sent our survey crew out there to do some triangulation and figure out exactly how high they were. The ship, the Coos Bay, was washed up by huge waves around 1948. As kids, me and Joe Garcia and Fidel and Ronnie and Wesley Johnson were looking at the old wreck. A gentleman who was there rummaging around pulled out a knife. The handle, probably it was brass, but it looked to us like gold, and the blade was still in pretty good shape. It looked like a pirate knife. The guy just yipped a couple of times and took home this fantastic knife. Red was a fishing character from the pier. Even when I was a small kid, there was Red. People would hustle for clams and then come back, and he'd have a bigger and better and more clams than anyone else. Off the pier, he's the one that snags the big ones, always. He had a 6th sense when it came to fishing. Still does. Cabezon is a fish that is highly prized. Even in Indian times, it was a prize eater. At the river mouth, you could catch them. Cabezon and surf perch. There have been some great cowboys from Ventura. Probably the greatest was Ramon Ortega. His father was keeper of the mission gardens, and as a boy, he grew up around the old mission, and later, he became the most well-known cowboy anywhere. Another was Johnny Berrios. In 1949 or 1950, he was a contender for calf roping at rodeos all over the state. There was a world champion rodeo at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, and Johnny took 3rd place. There was an editorial in the local paper, and he was a local hero for that. Shorty T was a quarter horse that he had trained, a tremendous horse that he had for years. I remember that, as a kid, watching him practice roping in his backyard. The Berrios family lived in Mita Street, close to Romero's Market. He had a little sawhorse set up with horns on it, and he would practice his roping. Nobody was tougher than Johnny Berrios. Just solid as a rock, never caused any trouble, but if you pushed him in a corner, you suffered serious consequences. In the Second World War, he was right in the middle of it, taking Europe back from the Germans. Heine Sanchez was an important figure in downtown Ventura. He was a local icon going back to the First World War. He was with a large group of Venturans going to war. He was a barber for many years, and then he started the pool hall in the 40s and ran it some 20-odd years. He was a moneylender to anybody and everybody. They had to have some credentials, but he would lend money, no interest, to anyone who needed it. I asked him one time, "What's the story?" And he says, "Well, it's a business, and I get about a 95% return on my money, and it's just a business principle that I have." But there were many that would borrow money from him and then struggle to pay it back. Thanksgiving time, he would deliver turkeys to the Ventura Police Department. Not just 1 or 2, but everyone would get their turkey down there. Just a good way to keep on good terms with the local police department. Heine Sanchez was a gambler. He loved to gamble, and there was a group of people that loved to gamble. Once they were playing in the back of Romero's Market, and the daughter was up front tending the store and was getting robbed while these guys were playing poker in the back and not even knowing it. There were some seamy aspects to the whole thing, but The guy had a set of angel wings. He was a Christian Scientist and never took medication, never needed a doctor's help. He died in his late 70s. Everybody had plenty of respect for him. Heine Sanchez, a big, big individual. Ralph Romero was in the same category. He covered several generations and did some outstanding things. Operated the Green Mill Ballroom for many years. Local businessman, totally well liked. I want to say loved by the whole neighborhood for generations and generations. Always a very polished, very friendly, good-spirited feeling that he carried with him all the time. The national market was the Jew family. They charged groceries there, and they gave me credit. The old New York store was where the Pep Boys store finally ended up, but before that, it was a small department store. Casa Martinez. The Martinez operated their restaurant at the corner of Ventura Avenue in Mita 5 or 6 years. When airplanes became fashionable, they had a little bit of a dirt runway there by Hobo Jungle. In 1948 or 49, it snowed all over Southern California, even at the islands out there. Everything was a whiteout, totally, and all of us were just absolutely entranced. I remember waking up in the morning and everything, and it had about 3 inches of snow on it. The National Guard was stationed out at Seaside, but the gun mounts they put up during the war stayed around for a long time. Overhanging Rock in Matilaha is where they built the Matilaha Dam. They had to destroy this monument to build the dam. I worked for the department that built it. The dam is just a horrible mistake, sitting there today completely full of silt and actually a danger to life and limb downstream. Sometimes you've got to have dams, but mistakes are made, and that was damned sure one of them. There were 2 teen time places where teenagers would go. There was one down at Seaside Park that was called the Pan American Teen Time. The night that Jimmy Reed and Johnny Hooker came to the sidecar, I was there, thanks to my buddy Art Webb, who's a jazz enthusiast. It was the eve of Easter, 1967, a Saturday night. Me and the guys played music for about 2 years around town. A garage band, if there ever was one. The Dynamic T-Birds. Johnny Palacio, Ernie Medina, Alan Garcia. We started playing together and working out a repertoire. We played for about 2 years. Most of the time, we played at the Dunes Cafe in Oxnard Beach, from the flats mainly. It was a duet guitars with drums, no bass. By today's standard, it would be a really hollow sound, but Johnny and I worked out real hard. We had a good guitar duet, and I played heavy on the chords to give it the rhythm section part of it, and Johnny was a very good guitar player all the way around. We played Tequila, Night Train, La Bamba, and a section of Latino songs and rock and roll tunes. Musically, we should have stayed in the garage, but socially, we had a hell of a following, and we surprised the hell out of a couple of nightclubs. When we played the Bandar here, Pete Castro was the manager. He was Rory Calhoun's brother-in-law, and he was big time as far as locals were concerned. He heard about us and hired us on for a 2-week engagement, and he told us we broke records there, jammed the place. But it was mainly the following we had. The music was just secondary. Well, that concludes the whole darn horse and pony show. And that was Jimmy Capito, the one and the only, the legendary.